Well, good morning, everyone. Really enjoyed yesterday's conference. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I came in here kind of having been familiar with component control and the quantum software, but never really having used it myself because I'm just a poor dumb lawyer from Washington, D.C. So a lot of what I saw yesterday was totally new to me. And one of the things that I quickly learned is that the quantum software is very customizable. Customizable is scary because you actually have to know what you're doing. You have to understand what you're trying to accomplish. You have to be deliberative as opposed to merely going by instinct. So I want to thank Paul and the rest of the Q group for inviting me here today. And I also want to thank Paul and his group, the board, and also Component Control for opening my eyes to some of what you all are doing. Because what you all are doing is being deliberative. You're using this software, updating the software, changing the interfaces that you use with this software, and you're doing it because you guys are the smart people in the industry. You guys are the ones that are making use of the hard software and making it your own. A lot of other software packages don't have the customizable functions that it appears that Quantum does. And so people can go into those other packages and kind of use them by instinct. But instinct is not always the way that is best. As Paul mentioned, I represent the Aviation Suppliers Association. ASA has been a trade association, a nonprofit association since 1993. We focus on promoting aviation safety, and we do that through programs like the accreditation program, where ASA's auditors actually audit companies' quality systems to ensure that they meet minimum FAA recommended standards from AC 0056. But we also try and circulate business knowledge because, like you, we believe that knowing, understanding, and being deliberative rather than acting on instinct is the right way to approach things. Now, there's always going to be people out there that act by instinct. And the people that act by instinct are a little bit like moths. They're fluttering about, and they're drawn to the bright lights. They're drawn to the flame. But the problem with being drawn to the flame, obviously, is sometimes you can get a little too close to the flame. And I see from the Q group and from the presentations yesterday that you are the sort of people that are not going to be drawn to the flame. You're going to be drawn to the facts. You're going to be drawn to the right way to do things. So my purpose today is to provide you with some more information for your toolbox that will help you do things right and make the right decisions by having the right business knowledge. So I'm going to launch right in with a definition. And you will find that because I'm a Washington, D.C. lawyer, definitions are really important. We use this term approved part. And I can remember having discussions with the FAA in the 1990s about what it means to be an approved part. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is we use this term to mean the good parts. But the FAA uses it in a slightly different way. They use it to mean a very specific definitional set of parts. And in fact, the definition changed, and now it's been a few years. It was 2009 when the change was published. But these things do change as new ideas come into the FAA. So approved means that something is either approved by the FAA or it's approved by a person to whom the FAA has delegated authority, such as a DAR or an ODA, or it can mean something approved by a non-US government that has been accepted into the United States under the terms of a bilateral agreement between the United States and the foreign government. Bilateral agreements are agreements that are something less than treaties. Generally, the ones that I'm talking about are made between the FAA and the foreign equivalent of the FAA. So for example, there's a bilateral agreement between the United States and the EU that was negotiated between EASA on the EU side, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States on the US side. Now, these bilateral agreements do vary in their text. They are not identical, but there are certain commonalities among them. Generally speaking, there is a finding that the U.S. system of oversight and the non-U.S. system of oversight are sufficiently similar that we can accept each other's findings within certain parameters. And usually under the bilaterals, we say that the United States can accept parts that have been approved under a production certificate by the foreign government, and the foreign government can accept parts that have been approved under production approvals from the United States. You'll notice that I use two different terms, production certificate and production approvals. Generally speaking, under the bilaterals, the United States will only accept production certificate parts. Production certificates are issued for complete aircraft, complete engines and propellers, and authorize those parties to also make replacement and modification parts. We have TSOAs, PMAs, and PCs in the United States, and usually our bilaterals say that our foreign trading partner will accept all of those. Generally speaking, under the bilaterals, we will accept technical standard order authorization parts from a foreign government if there is a correlative U.S. design approval. So the U.S. issues letters of design approval for those foreign TSO'd parts. And that's also something that's changing in our near future. Historically, if you wanted an ETSO article, so a European Technical Standard Order article, then in order to import it into the United States, we needed a U.S. letter of design approval. It was an extra step for the manufacturer. Very shortly, the United States and Europe will be moving to a system where the United States will directly accept foreign TSO'd articles, and Europe will directly accept U.S. TSO'd articles without the intervening step of the letter of design approval. And this is one step closer to globalization of our systems such that you can get one approval in the United States and rely on it. And for those of you that are distributing, this opens up the world of what you can accept from Europe. For those of you that are repair stations doing installations, this opens up what you can accept from Europe. And when the changes come out, it's going to be important to make sure that you educate your employees about what to look for, because parts that were rejectable in the past will become acceptable. Now, there's two different terms that we throw around, airworthiness and approval. Airworthiness means that a part meets a FAA-approved design configuration, generally, and is in a current condition for safe operation. And we tack on that last little bit because you can have an approved part that meets an FAA design approval configuration that then gets dropped on the floor and dented and is no longer in a condition for safe operation. It's one of the reasons that we rely upon certificate holders to do installations and to do it in an educated fashion by looking at the parts and making sure that they continue to be in an appropriate condition. The other side of this is approval. The FAA approves designs and they approve production quality systems. And we call the parts that come out of these approved production quality systems approved parts. But approved parts, again, are not always airworthy because they can suffer degradation, they can suffer damage, and that's one of the reasons why that last step of before any installation happens always is looking at the part to make sure it's still in the right condition. Now, for approved parts, the FAA has published a regulation that tells us that there's really 6 categories that they feel are approved. If you look carefully at the specific language, it tells us that no one's allowed to produce these parts unless they fit into one of these 6 categories. So the parts that you're receiving into your inventory for replacement purposes, for modification purposes, should fit into one of these 6 pigeonholes. And by the way, I can tell you that in the next few years, we can expect a 7th pigeonhole, and I'll talk about that 7th pigeonhole when we get to the end of this. First of all, produced under a type certificate. Now, a lot of you are looking at that and saying, wait a minute, a type certificate, that's a design approval, not a production approval. And that's true, and actually the FAA authorizes new type certificate holders to produce parts for up to 6 months in anticipation of obtaining the production certificate. So brand new type certificates actually have some limited production authority for a limited time. But here's the big one, and this is where most of your parts are going to come from, produced under an FAA production approval. The FAA issues 3 different types of production approvals: PC for production certificate, PMA for parts manufacturer approval, and TSOA for technical standard order authorization. In addition, the FAA says that another category of parts that are acceptable are standard parts. Now, standard parts are going to be things that are made either to a US government standard, such as a mil spec, and a lot of the mil specs have been retired and been replaced by industry consensus standards, many of them held by the Aerospace Industries Association. So industry standards are also going to be acceptable, and to be an industry standard, the standard has to be published by an industry standard setting body, has to be publicly available, and generally, because it has to be publicly available, that means the proprietary standards are going to be excluded from that definition. And if you're wondering why you've never seen that information that I'm presenting in any FAA guidance, it's because these standards actually come from the General Services Administration, GSA, which sets these sorts of specifications for the entire US government. Now, you'll notice that this is a little bit different from some of the European definitions. And the main difference is under European standard parts definitions, standard part can be a government standard, an industry standard setting body standard, or it can be a standard established by a design approval holder, specifically a type certificate holder. So that means that a company like Airbus can define standard parts in their type certificate, and those become standard parts in Europe. Now, that has caused problems for the United States for over 20 years, and for over 20 years we've been wrestling with this. In the 90s, the Aviation Rulemaking Advisory Committee looked at that and said, hey, the United States should do the same thing. Boeing was a strong proponent of this, and it was in an era where we were looking to try and take unapproved parts and move them into an approved parts category. The FAA ultimately decided that was not the way they wanted to go, and the result was that Boeing took a lot of their proprietary parts and issued PMA assist letters so that their suppliers could get PMA. The 4th category is commercial parts. Commercial parts are a special category. It's actually a term that was used one way by the industry, and then the FAA published a radically different definition. I'm not going to spend much time on commercial parts, largely because commercial parts don't really exist. One company, one rotorcraft company, has gotten a small list of commercial parts approved, but basically the FAA said, if a manufacturer that has a design approval wants to apply to the FAA and prove to the FAA that there are parts whose failure won't affect the aircraft, then we'll let those be commercial. So the lawyers looked at this and said, no, that's not going to happen, because we don't want our design approval holders to incur additional liability in order to surrender business to third parties. So as a consequence, there just is not a business case for commercial parts to be defined, and therefore no one has defined commercial parts. Category 5, though, is a much more useful category, and that's things that are produced by an owner or an operator for maintaining or altering that owner or operator's product. Airlines do this, and general aviation owners do this as well. In order to be an owner-operator produced part, the FAA has issued guidance that says that the part either has to be designed by the owner or operator, or the owner or operator has to maintain a quality system and ensure the quality of the parts. So as long as they do one half of that process, that's good enough. So an airline can design a part and ask someone else to produce it as an owner-operator produced part. Or they can take a third-party design and have a quality system that ensures the parts meet the third-party design. What they can't do is just order a part and then describe it as owner-operator produced. And I've seen airlines that have tried to do that. They've ordered parts and said, you know, we know these are not approved, but we're going to call them owner-operator produced. Make sure if you're working with an airline customer or any other customer, an owner customer, and they want to describe parts this way, that they're doing one of these two functions. Finally, you can have parts that are fabricated by a maintenance entity. And the FAA has always had guidance, I shouldn't say always, but for decades has had guidance that recognizes this as an acceptable practice. But in 2009, when they changed the rules, they made things a little different. They narrowed things a little bit, and they said that it can't just be anyone who's doing maintenance. Someone who is doing maintenance or alteration that has a quality system is authorized to produce parts for consumption in the maintenance or alteration. So what that means is that a repair station, a Part 145 entity that has a quality system, which is currently required under Part 145, can do fabrication. It means that if you're an A&P mechanic working under Part 65, then you can fabricate things if you establish a recognized quality system, and you've got to have that recognized quality system in place. There's a lot of guidance out there about this. AC 4318 provides guidance to maintenance facilities that want to produce parts for themselves. 14 CFR 21.9 authorizes it. However, it's important to recognize that 21.9 also describes installation under Part 43. And I've run into people that have looked at that language and said, oh, that means the fabrication is under 43. But if you look carefully at the language, it's fabricated, and then there's a comma in the middle, and consumed in accordance with Part 43. So make sure that you note that difference. And that difference is important because approved parts are parts that are approved by the FAA. The FAA approves parts under Part 21, and these become approved parts under the Part 21 scheme. Now, the FAA also has a rule under 14 CFR 21.8D that I like to refer to as the anything they darn well please rule. And 21.8D basically says that the FAA is allowed to approve anything using any method that they want. So if the FAA tells you something is approved, it's approved, full stop. Now, one of the problems is the very next regulation is 21.9, that's the one we were just looking at. It says that anyone who produces one of these parts has to fit into one of the 6 pigeonholes. So there isn't a pigeonhole for the anything they darn well please rule. The FAA has recognized that as a problem. They've actually told the trade associations that they're going to fix that in the next iteration. I've sat down with Barb Capron from the FAA, and she has actually shown me the new text that they will be implementing. So the FAA is going to fix that, but they're going to fix it on government time, which means they're not going to fix it for several more years. Now, as I said, it's important not to be the moth. It's important to understand the rules. It's important to understand and be deliberative in your actions rather than acting on instinct. And I'm reminded of the story of the moth and the podiatrist. I have a friend who is a podiatrist. He's got kids that play baseball with my son. And he told me that he had a moth fly into his office recently. And what was a little more amazing than that is that the moth actually spoke to him. Said the moth fluttered in, said, "Hey, Doc!" He looked over and was thinking, oh my goodness, this is a talking moth. And the moth goes on and says, "I gotta tell you what's going on with me, Doc. My back hurts, my antenna hurts, my wings hurt, tired all the time." And my friend the podiatrist says, "Well, that's all very interesting, but I'm a foot doctor." And the moth says, "Wait, I got more. I think my wife is sleeping around with a different moth. My kids don't respect me. My parents won't talk to me." And my podiatrist friend says, "Well, that's all well and good, but I'm a podiatrist." And the moth goes on and he says, "Well, I have problems at work. My boss doesn't respect me, he laughs at me, my coworkers won't speak to me." And finally my friend says, "Wait a minute, stop. This is a podiatrist's office. We fix feet. So can you tell me what brought you into my office?" And the moth looks up and says, "Well, the light was on." So don't be the moth. Keep using that quantum system and keep being deliberative in your processes. I want to talk to you a little bit about counterfeit parts. Counterfeit is an important topic that is widely misunderstood in the industry. I've talked to FAA employees who don't understand what counterfeit means. I've talked to industry people who don't understand. Counterfeit parts actually fit into their own category. A lot of people assume that counterfeit and unapproved mean the same thing, and they don't mean the same thing. And if I were to illustrate it, it would look like this. You've got your ball of approved parts, you've got your unapproved parts off to the side, and your counterfeit parts actually straddle over both categories. That's right, you can have an approved part that meets the definition of approval that is nonetheless a counterfeit part as well. And there are legal examples of reported case law where that has been the case. The reason for that is because the standards for counterfeiting have absolutely nothing to do with the FAA. They come out of a law called the Lanham Act, and the Lanham Act says that something is counterfeit when you have an unauthorized use in commerce of a trademark where that unauthorized use is likely to cause confusion, deceit, or mistake. So the Guess jeans example is one of the classic examples. When Guess jeans were popular, there were knockoff companies making Guess jeans and passing them off as the originals. Those were counterfeits because they weren't the real jeans. They were an unauthorized use of the trademark, and it was causing confusion, deceit, or a mistake in the jeans or clothing industry. On the other hand, Levi's made jeans as well, but they put their own name on them. Those weren't counterfeits, even though they were still jeans, because they had a different trademark that helped to alleviate or mitigate the potential for confusion. In our industry, there's a lot of opportunities for us to run afoul of the Lanham Act, but there's a lot of opportunities for us to clarify things and clearly describe what our parts are all about. Great example is if you're describing an aftermarket part that is made by a different manufacturer. A lot of times these aftermarket parts are actually made by the true original equipment manufacturer. It might be a PMA company that sells to the aftermarket and also sells to the production certificate holder. So they are the source for the Boeing parts or the Airbus parts or the Embraer parts. But they also hold PMA and sell to the aftermarket as well. It is important to distinguish where these parts come from. And this is a real world example of something that I've seen people run afoul of, and I've seen the FAA raise concerns. This is actually someone from the FAA who understood the Lanham Act, who pointed out that someone who was using this phrase on the bottom, the not okay phrase, that the part was the same as the OEM part number. And it's true, it was not the same because it was made by a different company, and saying it was the same as implied that it had the same source. It's much better to say that that part is a replacement for the corollary OEM part. So little things like that are important to make sure that you properly represent the parts that you're selling. Now, what if you accidentally misrepresent a part? Does that mean you're going to jail for Lanham Act violations? And the answer is no. Fix it. Correct the issue in order to mitigate or alleviate the confusion, deceit, or mistake in the industry. Notify the other party in writing as soon as you recognize that there's a problem. Now, if they act in reliance on your misrepresentation, then you may be liable for their actions, but if you prove that you notified them, then they can no longer act credibly in reliance on your misrepresentation because you've corrected the misrepresentation. So that mitigates any potential for liability and problems. If you've issued the wrong paperwork, if you've given something the wrong production approval holder name, for example, then provide replacement paperwork that corrects the problem and ask them to return all copies of the wrong paperwork or to destroy all copies of the wrong paperwork. There's a lot of different ways to identify counterfeit parts and try and keep them out of your system. One of the things that you want in a system is you want to know your suppliers. One way to know your suppliers is to rely on programs like the FAA's Advisory Circular 0056 program. It's a program that the FAA published in 1994, and basically what the 0056 program does is it lays out a voluntary quality system that can be adopted by distributors. Distributors that adopt the FAA's voluntary quality system can then have third-party auditors that are authorized by the FAA come in, audit them, accredit them, and authorize them to be listed on the FAA's AC0056 database. These are companies that you know have established effective quality systems that represent the things that you desire in a distributor partner. Make sure that you've got a robust receiving inspection program. You want your receiving inspection process to protect your company. When things get red flagged in your receiving inspection program, you want to make sure that you have a process for responding to those red flags. You want to make sure that physically you are going to segregate the part. A lot of companies have a red cage. It is quite literally painted red in many companies for quarantining these parts. But yesterday, Nick Chambers had an excellent presentation where he talked about integrating your receiving inspection system with your quantum database and actually using the quantum database procedures to have a virtual quarantine in order to be able to have the parts in your system, but have them quarantined in your system in order to indicate that there's further research necessary on the part. And I thought it was just an excellent presentation. This was just one small part of the full receiving inspection presentation, but I thought it was an excellent presentation that showed you how you could take the real world things you need to do and use that quantum software as the tool to get it done. Things to look for include unusual finishes. This is a real-world example of some counterfeit parts. And if you take a look at these two parts, you'll notice that the one on your right has an inspection stamp and has the same finish on the mating surfaces as it does on the sides. You'll notice that the top surface on the one on the left is a different color, and it has no inspection stamp. That was enough to clue in a receiving inspector that this was a potential problem, and ultimately they were able to identify this as something that did not appear to be a genuine part. Make sure that you're looking at the parts, not just the paperwork. I've run into a lot of companies where receiving inspectors are trained and are very adept at looking at paperwork, but they forget to look at the parts. I had an air carrier individual from an air carrier that actually no longer exists tell me a story about a part that they had taken off wing, sent out for overhaul, gotten back from the overhaul, and it sat on a shelf for a short time until another air carrier called them up and said, hey, we need this part, do you have it in stock? And they said, yes, we do. So they sold it to air carrier number 2. Air carrier number 2 installed the part, and it flew until they had an inspection come up. They cracked open the engine to do the inspection and noticed that the serial number was wrong. So they said, oh, the job card must be wrong. It must be the other engine. They cracked open the other engine, and sure enough, that did not have a matching serial number either. So they did their own investigation and couldn't figure out what was wrong. They went back to air carrier number 1 and said, hey, we think that there's some sort of a problem here. Your paperwork doesn't seem to match the serial number on this part that you sold us several years ago. And they managed to hit the right person in the quality department who said, well, of course not, that's not a real serial number. When we went to our computerized system, we had parts that were serialized but not life limited, for which we did not know the serial numbers because they were still on wing. So we had these dummy serial numbers that went into the system, and when we took it off wing, we were supposed to replace that, but obviously we didn't. And therefore you got paperwork with a dummy serial number. Well, the interesting thing about this story is remember the history of this part. It was taken off wing and no one noticed that it didn't match the paperwork in the system or the serial number in the system. It was sent to a repair station whose receiving inspectors never noticed that the serial number on the part was not the same as the paperwork. It came back to air carrier number 1, and then it got sold to air carrier number 2, and then installed by air carrier number 2, and no one noticed that the paperwork and the part had different serial numbers. This is an indication of receiving inspections that have simply gone wrong. It is something very basic that you want to look at the part numbers and the serial numbers and make sure that these sorts of things match. You want to look at your nomenclature and make sure that it matches. I once got called into a potential SUPS investigation where the nomenclature didn't match. It was supposed to be a gasket, and what they got was a hinge, and it turned out that it was the right part number, but a different manufacturer. And that was what led to the problem. But that was a case where the receiving inspectors looked at the nomenclature on the paperwork and recognized a disconnect. Another thing you can look for is just things that are unusual in the parts. Here's a situation where one of these parts has normal inscribed part numbers, and one of them has the part number Vibrapine Don. And because this is a new part, you would not expect a new part to have a Vibrapine part number. So look through your documentation, identify and investigate the incongruities, and if it doesn't look right, then figure out why. Recently, GE put out an all operators letter that explained that there were misrepresented parts in the system. And these misrepresented parts, they were able to track and figure out what the minimum number of hours on these parts was, and it was dramatically higher than the number of hours that were represented on the paperwork. And when I spoke to some friends of mine about this, one of them pointed out that the dramatically low number of hours that had been represented should have been a red flag to begin with. And the reason was because no one brings out these parts at that low number of hours. So he said that if the parts had gone through his system, his receiving inspectors would have asked the question, why were these parts removed from an engine at such a low hour number, particularly in light of the fact that it was a full ship set of blades. So look for these unusual circumstances, scrutinize the parts, and make sure you get things right the first time, because oftentimes you don't get a second chance. I saw the problem of not getting enough chances in a friend of mine's bar. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Anyone? Good number of you, excellent. Next time you go, drop by a place called Kelly's Irish Times. It's on the Senate side, near the Senate office buildings, just kind of catty corner across from Union Station. The owner is a friend of mine, Brendan Kelly. And I used to spend a lot more time there before I had kids. And I remember one time I was sitting there chatting with Brendan on a Monday night. It's a very slow night. And in walks a man with a dog. Well, my friend Brendan says, "Hey, we don't let dogs in here. You can't come in here with that dog." The guy says, "Well, wait a minute. This is a talking dog." You may notice there's a theme of talking animals in this presentation. So my friend Brendan says, "Okay, that's absurd. It's not a talking dog." The guy says, "It's a talking dog, and I'll prove it to you. If I can prove to you that he's a talking dog, will you give me a free drink?" Brendan's always a guy who's up for a bet. He says, "Okay, sure, prove it to me." And the guy says, "Okay. Well, Bart, what do you find on top of a house?" And the dog says, "Roof." Brendan starts shaking his head, and the guy sees he's not making any headway here. And he says, "Okay, well, Bart, tell me, what do you find on the outside of a tree?" And the dog says, "Bark." Brendan says, okay, that's it. You're out of here. Get out of my bar." The guy says, "Give me one more chance. Give me one more chance. I'll ask him a question that, isn't going to sound like a dog noise." He turns to the dog and says, "Bart, who was the greatest baseball player that ever lived?" And the dog says, "Roof." And Brendan says, "That's it. You are out of here. Get out." And the guy walks out. He's dejected. He sits down on the curb in front of the bar. Dog sits next to him, and he looks up at the owner, licks his face, and says, "DiMaggio?" So if you're going to find counterfeits, if you're going to find SUPs, there are resources out there. This is the FAA's Suspected Unapproved Parts Hotline. You can call this number and make a report. You can also go online and make a report, and the online reports can be made anonymously if you choose. You also may have circumstances where you may want to contact law enforcement, either local law enforcement or federal. The FBI actually has a Fractured Skies program. It is actually part of their computer crimes division, but it's a group of individuals that have been specially trained on aviation issues and investigate aviation fraud. If you encounter an issue and you're not sure what to do, call the trade association. A lot of you are already ASA members, and we appreciate your membership, but we are your trade association. We are here for you, and we every day have people email us or call us. We used to have a lot of faxes. We don't get very many faxes anymore. But we do get emails and phone calls asking questions about, here's the situation I am facing, what do I do next? Who do I call next in order to move towards a solution? You guys have already demonstrated with your use of quantum that you're interested in solutions. If you're looking for a solution to an issue, feel free to call the trade association. Let us help you. Not only can we give you some initial advice about where to go next, but the other thing we do is we take the issues that are facing industry and we create educational materials. We create workshops and newsletter articles and blog articles that are designed to talk about general issues facing the industry and provide people with solutions. So if you're facing an issue, sometimes if you take a look at our blog and use the search engine, you may find that we've already blogged an answer to your question based upon other companies encountering the same sorts of issues. So thanks a lot for being here at this conference. Thanks a lot for being here at this presentation this morning. Do I have time to open things up for questions?
Yes, you have about 7 minutes.
Awesome. I'm well known for going overtime, so this is a real treat that I've come in 7 minutes under. Does anyone have any? Well, wonderful.